Resuming debate, the Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to thank the honourable member from across the way from Timmins, James Bay, for providing us with this very important opportunity to have this substantive discussion, and certainly want to acknowledge all members that are here in this House to participate in this debate. I am very proud to come from a small community off the west coast of British Columbia, Wewakai, and I'm proud to be an Indigenous person and stand up in this honourable House and speak to this important issue, the issues of Indigenous peoples in this country, and to participate in the debate. I add my name to the many names and people who have spoken with respect to the incredibly sad situation that exists in Attawapiskat, that exists in communities like La Loche, that exists in so many Indigenous communities across this country, where we see conditions of poverty, where we see conditions of despair, a lack of hope. And as an Indigenous person, one that was raised to be proud of who I am, to be proud of where I come from, this is something that I look at Indigenous communities right across the country and want to ensure that we collectively create the space in Indigenous communities where there is that sense of hope, where there is that sense that if you work hard, that you can achieve anything you want to in terms of this country, in this country. I want to applaud all of the members who have spoken to this issue, certainly recognize that there are immediate measures that need to take place or within the community of Attawapiskat and other communities. And I'm here today as the Minister of Justice and a member of this Honourable House, and would like to speak to the critical work that is ahead of us all. Thanking my colleagues, the Ministers of Health and Indigenous Affairs, for recognizing the importance of not only addressing the immediate needs, the immediate situation that exists, but for understanding the need for meaningful and systemic change. We in this House must not lose sight of the role this change will have in ensuring the health and safety of communities like Attawapiskat, and we must all collectively chart a path forward. The Prime Minister has tasked us to work with Indigenous peoples on a nation-to-nation relationship that is based on recognition. And I want to stress, based on recognition. This relationship based on recognition is transformative. A relationship based on respect, cooperation, and partnership. And in doing so, we can make real progress. As the former regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, I had the great fortune and opportunity to work with the chiefs in British Columbia and community leaders to develop mechanisms to build institutions of government to assist First Nations in the transition. I did this as well as a council member in my home community of Wewakai. Indigenous peoples from across this country are at an important juncture in our history as they seek to deconstruct their colonial legacy and rebuild their communities. And we all have a role to play. Even with political will, support, and resources, only the colonized can deconstruct or decolonize themselves. And change is not easy. It is not easy to remove the shackles of 140 years of life under the Indian Act. Our government, and I hope all members of this Honourable House, is committed to ensuring in partnership that we work with Indigenous peoples to do just that. Relationships with Indigenous peoples in Canada are of paramount importance, and we are committed to renewed relationships that recognizes that solutions to one of the biggest outstanding public policy issues in this country needs to be addressed in a substantive way. For Attawapiskat and for all First Nations, the Indian Act is not a suitable system of government. It is not consistent with the rights enshrined in our Constitution, the principles as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. In addition to the need for social and economic support urgently needed in Attawapiskat, all First Nations, all Indigenous peoples need to be empowered to take back control of their own lives in partnership and with the full support of all Canadians. The good news is there are examples of how this can happen. There are successes in Indigenous communities across this country, and we need to build on those successes. The problem is that those successes are few and far between. Change has not happened quickly enough, nor evenly throughout our great country, and Attawapiskat is one of those places. Our government is committed to establishing a nation-to-nation relationship, the one that the honourable member across the time said a moment ago, that respects an approach that will lay the framework for true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Mr. Speaker, I have a few more words to say, but I am indeed pleased to share my time with the member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River. Indigenous peoples, the challenge is not easy. It is complex. Indeed, for far too long, it has been ignored as a task as too difficult and monumental. But we can and must do better. This work, as has been said, is nonpartisan. It is broader than the Department of Justice, and it does not fall only to the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The nation-to-nation relationship is one of the most challenging public policy issues of our time, and I challenge all members of this House to work with us in building this relationship. There are no quick fixes to these issues. A substantive nation-to-nation discussion with Indigenous peoples is needed. We need to sit down and work jointly in order to ensure that Indigenous communities are strong and healthy and in charge and control of their own destiny. We need to bring life to and move beyond the scattered programs and initiatives. Reconciliation is a national project that requires the full engagement and commitment at the highest levels of government. This transformative work in Canada is far from complete. Some positive steps have been made. There has been positive steps made in the budget, but there needs to be more done. We need to develop a national reconciliation framework in partnership with Indigenous communities, and that requires the support of all parties and all members in this House. And that reconciliation framework needs to survive the life of one government. We have incredible challenges to meet with respect to our relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country. We have incredible opportunities to gain from engaging substantively. I look to, as the Minister of Justice and as one of the members in this honourable House, to international minimum standards that are articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we need to ensure that we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and we need to ensure, as with respect to our relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country, that we put it in place in terms of the constitutional relationship that is required with respect to Section 35. We need to ensure that we breathe life into Section 35 and that we complete the unfinished business of Confederation. And in doing so, we will have strong and appropriate governance in First Nations communities wherein they have moved beyond the Indian Act, and we can ensure that they are benefiting from the economy, that they are playing a substantive role in this country, and that we can ensure the ultimate objective that I believe every Canadian wants to achieve is to ultimately improve your quality of life. And improving and assisting Indigenous communities to improve their quality of life, we can ensure that Indigenous nations, their amazing cultures, languages, and traditions, and the pride that I felt, that I was taught, rooted in the potlatch, which is our governing system, is felt in Indigenous communities. within Indigenous youth, and this is our national project of reconciliation, and I look forward and look to every single member of this House to stand with us and ensure that we can achieve that. Yala kasla.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you, colleague, for your passionate speech here tonight. We're all passionate about this, but unfortunately, as been brought up in the House, it's 28 years. I'll say we've been dealing with this issue for over a century. One of the things that surprised me, Mr. Speaker, when I came to the House was education on reserves. And I know the discrepancy of what they get from the federal government and what each jurisdiction and each province gives First Nations. It's the value of education. We are told over and over and over again, Mr. Speaker, education is a way out of poverty. But I think we've overstepped our boundaries in some because we have no accountability here. I come from a background of 10 years as a school board trustee in Saskatchewan. For the first time ever, we had a premier gather all 28 school divisions because we were doing things for centuries the same way, and we were failing. He wanted to see, and in this case, Mr. Speaker, it is Premier Brad Wall, he wanted to see accountability from the school boards, from the teachers, from the parents, from the students. He asked a simple question. We need education and we need graduation rates to increase by 50% by 2020. So, Mr. Speaker, I asked the minister here tonight, can we have accountability in education? I am shocked we don't have an education minister on that side dealing with this, but we need accountability.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Well, I share the member's comments with respect to the importance of education and recognize that education is the means to unlocking the potential in Indigenous people as well as all people. In terms of education and moving forward, I'm pleased to be a part of a government that is investing in education. Not only just investing in education, like flowing the money to Indigenous communities, but looking to Indigenous communities for the solutions that they have developed, looking to Indigenous communities to ensure that we can approach and embrace First Nations control of First Nations education. Right across the country, there are examples where Indigenous communities have stepped up, and we are working with those communities and will continue to do with my colleague, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and across government. And on the issue of accountability, Indigenous communities in this country have developed their own accountability mechanisms from First Nations administration laws through education programs, and we need to embrace their solutions.
Questions? Question commentaire. Honorable député d'Abitibi, James Nunavut.
I want to thank the minister for her speech. I've been following Indigenous politics throughout for the last 35 years, Mr. Speaker, and I haven't had the opportunity to hear that kind of speech so far on Indigenous relations. So thank you for that speech. Mr. Speaker, the minister referred to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and she rightly pointed out that those standards that are provided for under UNDRIP are effectively the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. I recall when we negotiated and drafted this UN Declaration for a period of 23 years, we tried to think about every possible situation in the Indigenous world when we drafted those articles. And indeed, there are a couple of articles in the Declaration that refer to health, 21.1, 21.2, 24. I want to ask the minister, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the minister a very simple question, because I've been listening carefully to the Prime Minister. I've read carefully the letters of mandate to the ministers, and they all refer to implementation of UNDRIP. And I want to ask the minister, because call to action number 43 of the TRC refers to adopting and implementing the declaration. Does she make that distinction? Is that a simple oversight? Because you adopt legislation and you implement.
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to acknowledge the honourable member from across the way and thank him for his ongoing efforts and commitment to ensure the advancement of Indigenous peoples in this country through mechanisms like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have been very clear that we will embrace the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I say embrace and ensure that the minimum standards that are articulated in the Declaration form and are brought home to here in Canada to ensure that we take declarations and mechanisms as such and be able to translate them into practical and meaningful benefits on the ground in communities here in Canada. We have an opportunity under Section 35 with the minimum standards articulated in the Declaration to ensure that we work together to define exactly what that means and how we can translate those into practical standards on the ground.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy River.